You think you're safe in here? You're not. Gavin Turner's voice was a low whisper as he glanced over the crowded mall from his vantage point in the security office. Beneath the facade of his calm demeanor, a storm of anger and betrayal had been brewing for years. A decade of following orders, being overlooked, and having his authority chipped away bit by bit had led to this moment. The doors locked, the lights flickered, and the last shred of safety inside Westgate Mall vanished. No one could escape. Not now, not ever again. With a steady hand, he reached for the rifle beside him. The day of reckoning had arrived. The mall, once a symbol of comfort, now felt like a zoo, a gilded cage with no way out. Westgate Mall had always been a place of energy, a pulse in the heart of the city. At first glance, it seemed like any other shopping complex, polished floors reflecting bright neon lights, overhead speakers piping in upbeat music, and the pleasant hum of commerce in the air. Children raced past in a flurry of laughter, tugging at their parents' hands as they rushed to the food court. Shoppers meandered through aisles filled with racks of clothing, while employees worked behind counters, offering polite smiles to the passing crowd. The morning light filtered softly through the glass walls, casting a golden glow over everything it touched. The mall was alive, and it was safe. Or so they thought. For Gavin Turner, this place had been home for nearly 10 years. As the head of security, he had come to know every inch of Westgate Mall. The layout was etched in his mind, every shortcut, every blind spot, every moment when the building seemed to breathe. He could trace the path from the escalators to the emergency exits with his eyes closed. Every door, every lock, every security camera, he had mastered them all. He had become a fixture in the mall, a steady presence who walked the halls with a measured pace, his uniform crisp and his boots shining to a dull gleam. To the unknowing, he was just another employee, another face in the crowd. But behind his controlled exterior, something was stirring. Gavin had become a ghost in his own life, drifting through the motions without ever truly being seen. For a long time, he had prided himself on being the model employee, the one the new hires came to for advice, the one the staff relied on when something went wrong. He commanded respect from the customers and staff alike, and his authority was never questioned. But as the years wore on, the cracks began to show. His position, once one of power, had started to feel like a cage. A cage built from corporate policies, unreasonable demands, and the endless push for more sales and more foot traffic. Gavin had always felt the weight of that cage, but it had become unbearable recently. The mall's management had become increasingly distant, more concerned with numbers than people. Their corporate memos demanding more hours, more surveillance, more presence were always accompanied by the same impersonal signature: maximize efficiency, maximize profits, no raises, no appreciation. Just the expectation that he would continue to carry the burden without a word of thanks. The final straw had come. Just 2 weeks ago, the new regional manager had come in, promising a fresh start for the mall and its staff. Gavin had felt the sting of that phrase, a fresh start, like a slap in the face. It wasn't a fresh start for him. No, for him, it was just another reminder that his experience meant nothing. The manager had walked into his office, tossing him a new set of protocols, without so much as a glance at the years he'd spent here, silently hoping that his position would carry some weight. But the manager had only looked at the bottom line. The numbers, the results, the arguments had been heated, Gavin's frustration bubbling to the surface as he confronted the manager. But it had been a one-sided battle. He had raised his concerns, but they had fallen on deaf ears. The manager had simply smiled and assured him everything would be fine. That day, Gavin had stood in his office, the door clicking shut behind him, and knew that his role at the mall was only temporary in the eyes of those who controlled it. He was just another cog in the machine, but machines could break. And today, Gavin would make sure this one did. He moved through the mall, his steps deliberate and calculated. The morning had unfolded as usual, with the early shoppers wandering through the halls, eager to begin their weekend routines. Gavin checked the entrances, nodded to his fellow guards, and made sure everything was in order. His movements were steady, almost ritualistic. He began his rounds, methodical in his actions. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place, until he came across the door to the security office. Inside, He had already prepared everything he needed. The security override panel, the locks on the exits, the cameras all within his reach. But there was one more thing he needed: control. And that was what he had, in abundance. He glanced at the monitors, watching the mall's pulse through the live feeds. Families walked by, employees stocked shelves, and everything seemed perfect, just as it always did. He felt the anger rising again, but this time, it wasn't just a quiet storm, it was a force he could no longer ignore. His fingers hovered over the buttons. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him, but he knew it was the only way. The only way to make them listen. The only way to prove his worth. With a deep breath, Gavin reached out and initiated the lockdown. A faint click echoed through the air. It was the sound of the mall's last breath of freedom. From this point on, it would be his to command. The doors locked. The lights flickered. The sense of safety now gone. Gavin turned away from the monitor, his fingers still hovering over the controls as the moment stretched before him, heavy with unspoken thoughts. His position as the head of security should have meant something, but it hadn't. At least, not to the people who mattered. The steady stream of complaints, from both customers and management, had worn him down over time. He'd watched as the mall's upper management treated him like a cog in a machine, one that was easily replaced. A customer service complaint here, a staffing issue there. All dismissed as minor annoyances. No appreciation. No recognition. His role as the security chief had become little more than that of a walking punching bag. But the tipping point came today. It was a minor interaction. Something that could have been easily forgotten. But for Gavin, it was the spark that set everything ablaze. He had just walked past a kiosk where a teenage clerk had been struggling with an irate customer. The man was shouting about a discount, something Gavin couldn't care less about. But the disrespect in the air was undeniable. As the scene escalated, the young clerk, visibly shaken, tried to apologize, but the customer only grew louder, waving his arms in frustration. It was the way the customer spoke, the way he dismissed the clerk so effortlessly, that finally pushed Gavin over the edge. "Hey!" Gavin's voice was low, but firm as he stepped into the fray. "There's no need for that. Let's handle this calmly." The man shot him a look, dismissive at best, before waving a hand as if to say, "Get out of my way." "What do you know, huh? You're just a security guard. Just stand there and do your job." The words stung, but it wasn't the insult that angered him. It was the sheer arrogance, the complete disregard for him, for his position. For all the years he'd spent patrolling these halls, making sure everything was running smoothly, he was nothing but a background player in everyone else's world. The rage he had carefully hidden for so long simmered to the surface. Without a word, Gavin stepped forward, grabbed the man's arm firmly, and led him to the side. "That's enough," Gavin said, his voice colder now. He made sure to stand taller, to loom over the customer just slightly. For a moment, there was a flash of hesitation in the man's eyes, an acknowledgement that maybe he'd overstepped, but it quickly dissolved into a sneer. The customer mumbled something under his breath before storming off, muttering curses. As he disappeared into the crowd, Gavin watched him go, his hand still clenched in anger, but his body tight with the realization that this would be the last time anyone ever disrespected him. He had given too much of himself to be pushed aside like this. The moment the customer was out of sight, Gavin took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. He turned, casting a glance at the mall's front entrances, where people came and went, none the wiser to the storm quietly building behind closed doors. He looked toward the security monitors, toward the cameras that would watch his every move, and a thought began to form, dark and powerful. What if I made sure they couldn't leave? What if I showed them just how much power I have? His decision came like the flick of a switch. A mall had always been a place where people felt safe. But Gavin could feel that illusion of safety slipping away. The idea that the game was about to change, but the plan had already begun. He could feel it. Every step he took was leading him closer to something he couldn't undo. Something he didn't want to undo. As he continued his rounds, Gavin took one last look at the emergency exits, making sure that everything was in place. The locks were secure. The people inside, blissfully unaware, continued to go about their day. But for Gavin, the tension was palpable, building with each step. Something wasn't right. Something had changed. And Gavin Turner, head of security, was the only one who knew. The mall was his now. And no one, not the customers, not the employees, and certainly not the authorities outside, would be able to stop him. Gavin paused in the middle of the main concourse, his boots tapping lightly against the polished tiles. The sound echoed in the empty space as families, workers, and teenagers passed by, unaware of the storm that was about to break. The familiar hum of the mall surrounded him, the bustling chatter, the laughter of children running past, the soft clink of a cashier's register ringing up purchases. It was a normal Saturday morning, filled with the routine of consumerism, the predictable rhythm of a mall, alive with activity. But for Gavin, it was all just noise, background distractions to the symphony of his plan. He took one last glance around the open space, his eyes scanning the entrances. Everything was in order. He moved toward the security office with measured steps, his presence barely noticeable among the flow of people. Once inside, he slid into his chair with practiced ease. The room was quiet, except for the soft hum of the equipment and the flickering monitors. Gavin's hands hovered over the console, already knowing what he needed to do. He took a deep breath, and with the quietest click of a button, the lockdown sequence was initiated. The transformation was immediate. At first, it was subtle, nothing more than a slight shift in atmosphere. The soft hum of the air conditioning seemed to deepen, the noise of the food court and shops growing muffled, as if the air itself was pressing in. A woman, her arms laden with shopping bags, walked toward the main entrance, her heels clicking against the floor. She reached for the door, expecting it to slide open automatically, but the panels stayed shut. Her hand grazed the glass, then moved to the sensor again. Nothing. She stepped back, momentarily confused, before trying the door once more. Again, nothing. She gave it a firm push, but the door didn't budge. A few feet away, a teenager, holding a drink in one hand and his phone in the other, tried the side door, then the emergency exit. Each time, the door remained immovable, as if the mall itself had decided to close in on him. He glanced around, and as his confusion grew, a chill began to creep over the mall. Other people began to notice. A few murmured to one another, wondering if something was wrong, but it was still too quiet to be truly alarming. Then, the lights flickered. Not all of them, but just enough to catch attention. A slight dimming of the overhead fixtures, followed by a brief silence that seemed to ripple through the building. The gentle hum of the music overhead stuttered, cutting out for a fraction of a second before returning. A brief, unexplainable moment that was enough to raise suspicion. People looked up from their shopping, from their conversations, their food. It was as if the mall itself had shifted into another world, one where safety had become uncertain. Gavin's fingers hovered over the console, making small adjustments, ensuring the lockdown was complete. The doors were sealed. The lights dimmed, leaving the mall in a half-light that felt unfamiliar, even disorienting. The public address system, which had always been a comforting voice for shoppers, was silent now. No music, no announcements, no voices to reassure them. The silence hung heavily in the air, the absence of sound making the footsteps on the tile seem louder. It took less than 2 minutes for the panic to begin. A woman near the food court, a toddler in her arms, attempted to leave through the same main exit. She reached for the door, expecting it to open, but found it locked. Her brow furrowed, and she tried again, pressing her palm to the glass. A man standing behind her, not realizing the situation, followed suit, and another. Before long, a small group had gathered at the door, tugging at the handles, pushing against the heavy glass. They shared confused glances, their uncertainty starting to show on their faces. "Is the door broken?" a man asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Woman holding her child stepped back, looking around at the others. "What's going on?" she whispered. The crowd at the door grew as more people noticed the situation. A mother, with her young son tugging at her sleeve, glanced nervously toward the exit. She moved to try another door. It didn't open either. As she looked around, her eyes widened, her panic rising. The energy in the mall had shifted. What had been an ordinary Saturday morning had morphed into something far more sinister. Though it wasn't yet obvious to everyone, families wandered. From one locked exit to the next, each attempt met with failure. Employees who noticed what was happening started murmuring to one another, trying to figure out what was wrong, unsure if it was a malfunction or something more. Gavin, the initial shock had passed. Now, the real terror would begin. In the security office, Gavin's eyes flicked between the cameras. The mall was now a maze, its walls and doors keeping people inside. His mind raced ahead, already planning the next steps. This isn't about just locking them in, he thought. This is about making them see. Making them understand what I've been through. Making them feel what I feel. He took a long, slow breath, leaning closer to the monitor. The first phase of his plan was complete, but there was more to come. The silence in the mall had deepened, suffocating, as Gavin moved from the security office toward the atrium. Every step was measured, deliberate, as though he were walking through a place he had known for years, but was now transformed into something completely different. The usual hum of the mall, the music playing overhead, the distant chatter of families, the footsteps of pedestrians was gone. It had all been replaced by the soft echo of his boots against the cold tile. Gavin's grip tightened around the rifle as he approached the central corridor, his eyes flicking from one monitor to the next, each one displaying the panicked movement of the trapped people. He could see them now, large groups huddled together, unaware that their time was running out. Some were clustered near the food court, others in front of the stores, and a few were still desperately trying the exits, futilely testing doors that would never open. The ones who were closest to the exits, the ones who were fighting the hardest to leave, would be the first to learn how small their world had become. His steps never faltered as he passed by stores, the dim light casting long shadows across the mall's polished floors. The air was thick with the smell of hot oil from the food court, mingled with the faint scent of panic that had started to seep into the mall's bones. Gavin didn't hurry. He wasn't chasing anyone. There was no need. He was in control, and he would wait for the perfect moment to strike as he rounded a corner, his eyes locked onto a family standing near a clothing store. The mother was clutching her child, eyes scanning the distance for an escape. The father had stepped forward, a furrowed brow on his face, trying to make sense of the situation. Gavin's hand rested on the rifle, steady. He let the seconds drag on, watching their helplessness, feeling the tension rise as they struggled to understand why everything had gone wrong. They would learn soon enough. Without a sound, Gavin raised the rifle, steadying his aim. His breathing was calm, controlled. He pulled the trigger, and the deafening crack of the gunshot shattered the fragile stillness of the mall. The mother's scream echoed off the walls, a high-pitched, gut-wrenching sound that split the air, followed by the unmistakable clatter of chairs and trays as people scrambled for cover. The bullet struck its mark, but the reaction from the crowd was immediate. Chaos erupted in every direction. People screamed, running in blind panic, pushing past one another, shoving their way toward anything that might look like an escape. It was chaos, but it was Gavin's chaos, carefully orchestrated, and now in full motion. The first shot had been the signal, the moment everything had changed. Gavin's movements were steady, precise. He didn't rush. There was no need. He had already planned their every move, anticipated their fear. They were trapped, and they didn't even know it yet. He watched as the survivors tried to scatter, their fear turning into desperation. But it was too late. The panic spread like wildfire. Families, workers, children, everyone was running, their breaths quick and shallow, their footsteps frantic and disorganized. But Gavin had seen this before. He knew how they would react. The herd would scatter, run toward the exits, try to find shelter. But the doors were locked, the halls were blocked, and no matter how fast they ran, they would end up at the same dead end. A woman dashed toward a store, slamming her palm against the door, only to find it sealed shut. She tried again, harder. This time, her hands trembling with panic. She glanced over her shoulder, but by the time she turned back to the door, Gavin had already moved closer, his rifle aimed at her. The shot rang out, and she collapsed onto the tile, her scream caught in her throat as the life drained from her body. The others, still running toward safety, barely even heard it. A man, panicked and sweating, tried to break a window with a fire extinguisher he grabbed from a nearby service station. He swung it with all his might, but it shattered only part of the glass, leaving jagged shards hanging precariously from the frame. He tried again, more frantic now, but the sound of another gunshot rang through the mall, and the man fell, his body jerking with the force of the hit. As he crumpled to the ground, Gavin continued moving, methodical, as though he were carrying out an order. The rifle never wavered in his hands. His calmness contrasted with the hysteria unfolding before him. The adrenaline coursed through him, yes, but it was nothing like what the survivors were feeling. For them, this was a nightmare, a reality they could never have imagined. For Gavin, this was just the execution of a plan that had been years in the making. He had learned patience over the years, but now that he was in control, every shot, every move he made was part of the grand design. The mall was his to command, and the people inside were his to shape. From his vantage point, Gavin could see the broken people, those who had fallen into his trap, their hope vanishing with every locked door and shattered window. They thought they were safe. They thought they had a chance to survive. As he walked through the chaos, he watched the people attempt to hide, attempt to find shelter. And when he came upon them, his rifle raised, his finger steady on the trigger, he knew they wouldn't survive. No one would. The mall, once a place of comfort and routine, had become a tomb. The desperation in the survivors' eyes grew as they realized their situation was far worse than they had ever imagined. What started as confusion and uncertainty had shifted into pure terror. But Gavin didn't notice. He didn't care. His transformation had been completed. He was no longer the man who had walked these halls, quietly protecting them all. He was the executioner now, the one who controlled life and death within these walls. And with every shot he fired, he was reminding them of the power he had always held. The echo of Gavin's boots against the mall's polished tile was the only sound left. The frantic running, the desperate cries of families, the screams of those who had realized too late that they were trapped, those had all faded. The mall, once filled with the hum of commerce and laughter, was now a hollow shell, its walls reverberating with the ghostly remnants of chaos. Most of the survivors had been picked off or driven into hiding. There were only a handful left now, huddling in corners, cowering behind shelves, too afraid to make a sound. They lay as still as possible, hoping against hope that Gavin's search would miss them. Their bodies trembled in the silence, their minds racing with the possibility that at any moment, his boots would be the next sound they heard, followed by the unmistakable crack of the rifle. Gavin moved slowly through the mall, taking his time as he checked each corner, each alcove methodically, and with the patience of a man who knew there was no need to rush. He had already seen everything through the cameras, but now he was walking it himself, ensuring that no one had escaped his notice. His movements were deliberate, calm, and completely controlled. There was no chaos now. The panic that had once flooded these hallways had been replaced by an eerie stillness, a silence that felt almost oppressive. As he passed the food court, his eyes scanned the scattered debris, the overturned tables, and the empty seats where moments ago families had been eating. Now, there was only the faint smell of spilled soda and the lingering scent of food that had been abandoned. A few survivors had been hiding behind the counters, but Gavin knew they were there. He knew they had nowhere to run. From the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of movement, just a flicker, a hand reaching out from behind a vending machine. But Gavin didn't hurry. He didn't need to. He simply walked toward the spot, each step measured, purposeful, as if the very floor beneath his feet belonged to him. The faint cry of a child reached his ears, a desperate, broken sound that made the silence even more suffocating. Gavin paused for a moment, standing in the middle of the concourse, his mind calculating. The sirens outside were getting louder, but they didn't matter anymore. He knew the authorities wouldn't reach the mall in time. The exits had been sealed, the power had been cut. They were too far away, and Gavin was in control. There was no hope for them now, only the slow, inevitable end. The survivors remained hidden, but their fear was palpable, hanging in the air like a suffocating fog. Every breath they took was tentative, every movement calculated to avoid detection. The slightest sound, footsteps, the scrape of a chair, A gasp might be enough to draw his attention. The silence between them and Gavin grew thicker with every passing minute. They were waiting for the inevitable, holding on to a shred of hope. That perhaps, just perhaps, he wouldn't find them. But Gavin knew better than to believe in hope. He had stopped hoping a long time ago. In his mind, the fear in the survivors' eyes, the trembling of their hands, was not a reflection of the terror he had caused. It was a reflection of their weakness, of their inability to control their own fate. He had taken that control from them, and he would not give it back. His steps took him past the department stores, where a few figures still clung to the shadows, trying to remain unseen. He watched them for a moment, knowing they had nowhere to hide. He didn't raise his rifle yet. There was no need. They were already trapped in his web, and he could feel their panic growing as they realized the distance between them and safety was growing further and further apart with every second dot as he walked through the darkened mall. His eyes flickered. Back to the security office. He hadn't been this in control in years. He had always done his job, kept people safe, kept the peace, but it had never been enough. Not for him. Not for what he wanted. And now, in this moment, he had become something else entirely. He had become the judge, the jury, and the executioner. A fleeting thought crossed his mind as he paused at the entrance to a jewelry store, where the last few survivors had gathered. The child's cry from earlier echoed in his ears, and for a brief moment, Gavin wondered if he was truly doing the right thing. A flash of guilt, a sudden surge of doubt, tried to break through the carefully constructed wall of detachment he had built around himself. Was this really necessary? Hadn't they all suffered enough? But then the thought passed. He didn't owe them anything. They had never truly seen him, never truly understood his sacrifices. For years, he had kept this mall safe, had kept the systems running smoothly, only to be passed over time and time again. The anger, the resentment, all of it came rushing back in a wave. This was the only way for them to understand. This was the only way to make them realize who he was and what he was capable of. His hand tightened around the rifle once again. The cold metal a reminder of his absolute control. He was no longer the man who had walked these halls in silence. He had become something darker, something more dangerous. The transformation was complete. The survivors huddled in fear as Gavin approached, their attempts to hide becoming more desperate. They cowered in corners, holding their breath, praying he would miss them, praying he would move on. But Gavin didn't miss anyone. He had become the nightmare they had never expected. Each step he took was one closer to ending their suffering. The sirens outside grew louder, but they were nothing more than background noise to Gavin now. He didn't care. He had made his choice, and they had made theirs. He was the one with the power now. He was the one in control. As Gavin passed the last few hiding spots, a strange, detached satisfaction washed over him. The survivors, those who had made it this far, were waiting for him to finish what he had started. He could feel the weight of his decisions, but there was no turning back now. No more waiting. No more doubt. This was the end, the aftermath of his actions would be a testament to his control, to the power he had wielded over them all. But for now, there was only silence, only the quiet hum of the mall, the broken cries of the survivors, and the echo of his footsteps as he moved through the wreckage of what had once been a place of safety. And in the end, that silence would be the most damning of all. The stillness of the mall had settled in like a suffocating blanket, thick with the silence of death. The once vibrant corridors, filled with the hum of human activity, were now eerily quiet. Gavin moved slowly, his boots scraping softly against the floor, cutting through the thick silence. The echoes of his movements seemed louder than they should be, amplified by the absence of life around him. The chaos, once an overwhelming storm of screams and frantic steps, had settled into a haunting quiet. Most of the survivors had been killed or trapped in their hiding spots. The sound of their fear only added to his satisfaction. He could feel the power surge through him, the total control over the situation over them. Outside, the sirens were growing louder. They were close now, but it didn't matter. Gavin had sealed off every exit, locked every door, disabled every escape route. The authorities couldn't reach the mall in time. The police cars circling the perimeter, the ambulances ready to race. To the scene, they were all irrelevant. The power had shifted. Gavin was in control. The sirens, the flashing lights, were a distant reminder of the outside world, but they had no place here. Not anymore. He had already completed what he set out to do. He moved further through the mall, his steps careful, calculated. The stores he passed were now empty, their shelves abandoned, their displays overturned in the wake of the chaos. The scent of food and perfume that once filled the air had been replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of blood, the scent of death. It hung in the air like a heavy fog, lingering in every corner, seeping into every crevice. Gavin didn't flinch. The smell was nothing to him now. It was a sign of his success, his total mastery over the situation. As he walked, a brief flicker of thought passed through his mind. He paused, looking down at the floor beneath his feet, the stark reality of the bloodied tile and shattered glass. Around him sinking in? For a moment, there was a brief tug of doubt, a tiny whisper at the back of his mind. What had he become? Was this really who he was now? The man who had once kept the peace, who had walked these halls with pride, was now a killer. His hands, once used to protect, were now stained with the blood of the innocent. Had he lost himself? Was this really the justice he had always wanted? But the moment passed, fleeting and insignificant. The thought was quickly pushed aside, buried beneath the weight of his justification. They didn't deserve my respect. They never did. They never saw me for what I was worth. His fingers tightened on the rifle, his grip steady and unwavering. This was what he was meant to do. This was what he was destined for. He wasn't a protector anymore. He was a force to be reckoned with. He had reclaimed his power, and no one, not even the authorities outside, could stop him now. Gavin's gaze turned cold, and he moved forward again, the final few steps of his journey now clear. There were only a few survivors left, those who had managed to hide long enough, those who had not yet realized that their time was running out. He would find them, just as he had found the others. One by one, they would be brought into the fold of his control. He would not leave anyone behind. Not this time. As he approached the final corner, he caught sight of a young woman, huddled behind a collapsed display rack, her body trembling with fear. Her eyes, wide with terror, darted around the room, looking for a way out. But Gavin was already there, his rifle raised. She had nowhere to run. Her breath caught in her throat as her eyes met his, a silent plea for mercy. Gavin's face remained emotionless. He wasn't the man who had once kept people safe. He had become something else entirely. Something cold, something unrecognizable. The rifle cracked again, echoing through the empty mall, and the woman's body slumped to the floor. The mall fell silent again, the faint cries of the remaining victims, the only sound that broke through the stillness. Gavin took a slow breath, looking around the mall once more. It was over now. The hunt had ended. The walls were closing in, but not on him. On them. The survivors, those few who had managed to evade him for so long, had finally run out of time. They would soon join the others in the silence of death. Gavin stood there for a moment, letting the weight of what he had done wash over him. There was no regret, no remorse. Just the knowledge that he had taken control, that he had done what he had to do. His hands, stained with blood, were a reminder of the power he had wielded. The mall was his now, and there would be no more interruptions. As the sirens continued to wail outside, growing louder by the second, Gavin knew that the final chapter of this nightmare was about to be written. He had created this world, and now it belonged to him. Sirens outside grew deafening as the minutes dragged on, but Gavin remained unmoved, his presence as steady as the gun in his hands. The mall was a graveyard, now empty, hollow, a monument to his control. The few survivors left were scattered and hidden, reduced to nothing more than a faint echo of humanity, their lives slipping away like sand through his fingers. Gavin stood in the middle of the concourse, his eyes surveying the carnage with a cold, almost clinical detachment. The mall, once a bustling hub of life and activity, was now a desolate place, littered with the remnants of shattered glass, abandoned belongings, and the lifeless bodies of those who had once walked these halls. The sounds of the outside world, the The urgent wail of police sirens, the crackling of radio communication, were just distant noise to him now. He was done. The hunt was over. For a moment, he almost felt it the faintest whisper of doubt. Was this what he had truly wanted? Had it been worth it to bring this place to its knees? But the thought was fleeting, easily buried beneath the weight of the actions he had already taken. The survivors, those few who remained hidden, could never understand the liberation he felt. The power he had seized, the control he had gained. There was no going back now. A sound of footsteps reached his ears, slow, cautious, deliberate. The police were finally here, just outside the mall's sealed doors. Gavin knew it was only a matter of time before they breached the perimeter, before they rushed in with guns drawn and demands for surrender. But it was too late. Too much had been done. The chaos he had set in motion could not be undone. A final, sharp noise pierced the silence, the distant sound of doors being forced open. Then, the steady rhythm of boots on tile. Gavin turned, his rifle raised. He wasn't afraid. This was the end, and he had no illusions about how it would play out. Either he would be taken in or killed, but the outcome didn't matter to him. His legacy had been written, and it was one that would not be forgotten. The mall, once a symbol of safety and community, now stood as a tragic reminder of how easily power, when abused, could destroy lives. In the end, it wasn't the victim's desperation, nor the police's futile attempts to stop him, that defined this day. It was the stark reality of a man who had once been a protector, turned into something far darker. And in the quiet aftermath, there was nothing left but the haunting silence of a place that had once offered comfort, now forever tainted by violence and death.